Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for being here for today's webinar on anti-Palestinian racism and the recently launched very exciting report by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. My name is Lena. I am one of the staff and members of the Hearing Palestine initiative here at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of our entire team and everyone else involved in today's organizing, thank you. We are so thrilled to be hosting this discussion. First things first, we will be doing a quick land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that our campus is located on the lands that Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River have called their home for thousands of years before Europeans have expropriated their territories in the 19th century. Southern Ontario is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and they account for 375,000 of Ontario's population, according to the latest consensus of 2016. We recognize the dispossession of First Nations and acknowledge that we who are non-Indigenous are beneficiaries of historical and contemporary forms of colonialism in Canada, and therefore stand in unequivocal solidarity with those who seek to dismantle this system and make this land a place of equal opportunity for all. There is a QR code at the bottom of the screen here, and it'll take you to a list of Ontario-based Indigenous organizations for your viewing, and it's all very accessible. So before we get started, before I hand things over to Alejandro, I did want to mention very brief logistical notes on our Zoom tonight. For questions, there will be a Q&A period where you're able to ask the speakers questions. I'm asking that we use the Q&A function located in the functions bar for Zoom. But if it's not a question related directly to the content of the presentation, please do not use the Q&A function because we have folks monitoring those. I'm happy to answer any questions, or you could also direct them to Alejandro Paz, Professor Alejandro Paz, via the chat. The event will be recorded from start to finish, but it may not be published online. However, if you do ask a question and it's published onto the screen, it'll be viewable to all the attendees and obviously online if circulated. Closed captioning is available. You just need to click the caption at the bottom of your screen. And I think that's everything for me. So I will pass things over to Alejandro now to get us started for the night.
Thank you so much, Lena. Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandro Paz, and I'm an associate professor in anthropology at the University of Toronto. And along with my colleague, Jens Hansen, I'm co-chair of the Hearing Palestine Steering Committee. I'm happy to welcome you all on behalf of the Hearing Palestine Initiative to this event to discuss the much anticipated and extremely timely, Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, or ACLA, report on anti-Palestinian racism, or APR. As a Jewish faculty member and an expert on historic Palestine and the State of Israel, I've been aware for a long time of the systemic racism that prevents clear and important discussions of Palestine in public, and especially at Canadian educational institutions. Events in the last few years have really brought those limits into stark relief. The donor interference at the University of Toronto Law School that ended the hiring of a human rights lawyer, the institutional response to the expressions of solidarity with democratic Palestinian movements of Javier Davila and Desmond Cole at the TDSB, or the CBC's retraction of the very word Palestine after it was uttered by a radio host. These are just a few examples among many, many others where APR becomes clear. The ACLA report goes beyond these very public examples and also discusses the less visible acts where systemic APR makes itself felt. The event today is co-sponsored by three groups, the ACLA, Hearing Palestine, and the Health Workers Alliance for Palestine, or HAP. I'll say a little about the first two, and then my colleague, Najib Safiuddin, will speak about the Health Workers Alliance for Palestine. Founded in 2005, the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association is a national association committed to providing professional support for the Arab legal community and advocating on behalf of the Arab community in Canada. You can find them on Facebook and Twitter, and their new website, very exciting, which I'll put in the chat, canarablaw.org. Hearing Palestine is an initiative at the University of Toronto to center the study of Palestine and to facilitate advanced multidisciplinary research on Palestine, past, present, and future. We are housed administratively under the umbrella of the Institute for Islamic Studies, and we always are very grateful to the director there, Professor Anwar Iman. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter on the website, and I will give you the link to that as well. I'll make one plug before we move on. Several University of Toronto programs, including Hearing Palestine, are sponsoring a screening by the Toronto Palestinian Film Festival for this Friday as part of commemorating the Nakba, or catastrophe, that is the expulsion and exile of the overwhelming majority of Palestinians during the War of 1948 as part of the creation of the State of Israel. The film is an animated one called The Tower, and it will be screened at Innis Town Hall Theatre this Friday at 6:30 p.m. You can sign up here. I'm now happy to turn it over to Najib, who is here. He's an assistant professor at the Temerity Faculty of Medicine and is here representing the Health Workers Alliance for Palestine. Thank you, Najib.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Alejandro. So I'm Najib Safiuddin. I'm here to speak on behalf of a newly formed group, although we've been advocating and working together for some time now, but we're officially formed as a group, Health Workers Alliance for Palestine, HAP for short. We are a group of health workers and learners who have come together in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people in the context of social justice. And we've actually spent a lot of the past few months working on confronting anti-Palestinian racism on campus. And so it's only fitting that we are here today to co-sponsor this event. Our group is looking for new members as well. So I want to just put it out there that we welcome all members or all individuals that work in the health field, whether they're learners, nurses, physiotherapists, physicians, everyone, or researchers. I want to thank Hearing Palestine for giving us the platform. And I also particularly want to thank the ACLA and Dania for this amazing work. This is very timely, very thoughtful, very convincing, and very, I think, very powerful. And I think it will act as help for a lot of us that work in the advocacy for Palestine and solidarity for Palestine work. I know, I am sure we talked a bit offline that this has taken so much of your and your group's time. And I think it's very hard for people when they read it to probably imagine how much time that's taken, but this is great. Thank you very much for doing that. And last but not least, we look forward as an organization, I think I speak for everyone who's a member, to work with all of you and others who are in the social justice advocacy in general in Canada and elsewhere, and particularly in relation to Palestine. So thank you all, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say in presentation. Of course, we've looked at the document. We're very happy to be here and to be listening.
Thank you so much, Najib. We'll now be introducing our first speaker and chief author of the ACLA report. Alejandro, if you'd like to give the introductory remarks to Dania.
Yeah, so it's really a pleasure to introduce Dania Majid, who I've been working with you now, Dania, on Hearing Palestine for about a year, and truly you bring so much energy and such a wonderful presence in helping us so much to get this initiative off the ground. So among the many amazing things that Dania does is she's co-founder and president of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. She's also co-founder and artistic director of the Toronto Palestinian Film Festival, and is a member of as I just mentioned, our steering committee at the Hearing Palestine initiative at the University of Toronto. In addition to being a longtime advocate for the Palestinian and Arab community, she is also a human rights lawyer and housing advocate with a legal aid clinic in Ontario. Dania completed her honorary Bachelor's in Science at the University of Toronto before completing a MES LLB at York University Osgoode Hall School of Law. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dania.
Thank you so much for those really warm introductions. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And so, I thank you very much for coming to hear about this report. It was a long process, as we described, but hopefully it is a worthwhile one for everyone who ends up using it. I suspect many of you here are here because you've experienced anti-Palestinian racism at some point in your life, or you fear it, or you know someone who has experienced anti-Palestinian racism. So, if this describes you, then, truly you are just as much of an expert on the topic as myself and my co-panelists. It is your experiences that, we have heard over the years, we have brought into this report. They were very much centered as we rewrote this report, thinking of you and how this report can be of assistance to you in this work. Really all we've done is package it nicely in a nice report, slapped a really nice cover on it, and gifted it back to you for your use as you see fit. So I'm going to start the conversation on this report as something that lawyers typically do when they first get a decision. And we flip to the very last page of the report before we start reading from the beginning. So Lena, if you can go to the next slide. I will start with where we ended off in this process with a description of the anti-Palestinian racism. And then we will go through the report and sort of talk about how we got to this point. So as you can see, this description is anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms, including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging, and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians and their allies, defaming Palestinians and their allies with slander such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist threat, or sympathizer or opposed to democratic values. So this is the description of the framework of anti-Palestinian racism that we ended up with. So I will next explain the journey and how we got to this point. So this is all outlined in great detail in the report, but I'll give you a high-level summary just so you can understand the thought process. What sparked, the spark that triggered this work came in September 22, when we received word from a colleague that UofT had de-hired Dr. Azeezah after a donor, who was also a judge on the Tax Court of Canada, warned the Faculty of Law against hiring her because of her scholarship on Palestine, Israel. This was pretty shocking, and it made international news. But for many of us who do this work, it was not surprising, as we have heard many of these stories over the years from academics who describe to us about being silenced or losing opportunities because of their work. So when this scandal came about, the thought was, finally, we have a case that showed that this, in fact, was not all in our heads, that this type of silencing does occur, and we finally had documentation of it. So, the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, we started mobilizing on our end with our partner and allies. And in that work, we started using or talking about what had happened at the University of Toronto as anti-Palestinian racism, specifically the Palestinian part of that term, because we wanted to make sure that Palestine was centered in the discussion, along with the harms to Palestinians that resulted. We did not just want it to be sort of, swept under the carpet and just thought of, as an issue just about donor interference or academic freedom. But it really came, the root of the scandal was about silencing Palestinians. And this approach was a little bit different than what our usual approaches have been in the past, where we relied on international law to validate or justify the soundness of our positions on Palestine. But, in 2020, at this time, the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, along with others, we have been learning from, different anti-racism movements, from the Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous solidarity movements, and their responses to racism and settler colonialism. And, they have created a seismic shift in our understanding and engagement on racism. And instinctually, when we saw what happened at UofT, the right thing to do was to call this racism, call it out as anti-Palestinian racism, rather than debate the merits of her scholarship. So in February 2021, fast forwarding a little bit, we decided to file a submission to the Cromwell Review into the hiring scandal at the Faculty of Law. And we prepared our submission with a critique of the scandal using an anti-Palestinian racism lens. And in preparing those submissions, the first thing we did was look up academic articles on anti-Palestinian racism. And to my surprise, there were none. I was able to locate a few blogs and online articles where variations of the term anti-Palestinian racism were used to characterize incidents or actions, but they were not a detailed definition or framework of analysis of what anti-Palestinian racism was. So, in the course of our work with other solidarity groups, we've heard people talking about, needing a definition of anti-Palestinian racism or discussing the need for one. So in preparing the Cromwell Review, ACLA and our advisors quickly developed one and used it to analyze what happened at UofT. Now, we decided not to publish our Cromwell submission publicly because we did include something that we called a working draft definition of anti-Palestinian racism. But because of the timelines and the very quick turnaround, we did not have time to consult on it before it went into the report. And we did not want to unilaterally impose our definition on the Palestinian community without getting input first. And we needed to answer a few key questions before we even published it. The first being, does the community even want a definition? Is it helpful to have a definition for our work? If so, was this definition comprehensive? Was it missing anything? Or could a definition itself even be harmful to our work? So to better understand everyone's thoughts on this, we prepared a survey that included just the definition that we had included in the Cromwell report and no context, nothing else, because we did not want to persuade anyone one way or the other. They just got that paragraph, and they were asked to answer those questions along with a few others. And this was sent out to key stakeholders, solidarity groups, academics, legal scholars, parent groups, other allies in Canada, the US, in Europe, and Palestine to seek their input. And we started getting that input quite quickly. Many filled out the surveys, some emailed us, some called us up, and overwhelmingly people were in support of having a definition and thought this one was a good start. However, come May 2021, we had all the events happening in Palestine, including the attacks on Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, and the protests of both in occupied and historic Palestine. And this was another seismic shift in the conversation and discourse and solidarity on Palestine. And of course, during this time came a whole new set of scandals, against those in Canada who are trying to silence the support of Palestinian rights. So we followed these developments very closely, to see how people were talking about them, how People described these incidents, how they engaged in these incidents, how our allies and those in solidarity with us were, talking about these incidents, the statements of support that came out. And then, a few projects came up during this time. So it really wasn't until about November, December 2021 when we were able to return back to gathering all the, looking at all the submissions we got, all the feedback we received, all the consultations and research to get back into preparing this report. But this delay was invaluable because during this time, the ground had shifted a lot since we started the consultation process. So many of the respondents provided us with really key insights, vital insights, and all of this is summarized in the report. So there's too much to go into, but a lot of people were seeking more from the definition. So they thought it was a good start, but they were also wanting to add additional points. So add this, add that, add this, add that. And we kind of were in a bit of a quandary of how do we keep an accessible, short, paragraph-long definition while including all this information. So we reworked the definition and we provided an accompanying commentary to what we call now the description of of anti-Palestinian racism, in hopes the commentary will provide greater clarity and explanations of the framework of anti-Palestinian racism, so people can understand what the description involves. Then once we had the first draft, we did at least another 3 rounds of peer reviewing, which triggered important feedback, which then got us back into researching, doing more consultations, switching our focus from a definition approach to a description, naming, and framing approach, which was a significant sort of exercise we had to reconcile to understand which approach would be better, which one met the needs of the community better, and how can we make sure that Palestinians or those on the front lines who were seeking a definition could still have their needs met, but still acknowledging, the very serious limitations that come out of a definition. So we did that research. We moved to a description instead of a definition. Had more rounds of consultations, research, a lot of sleepless nights before we were able to publish this report. So, I want to thank everyone who was involved in this process, who, let me talk to them about their thoughts, who peer reviewed. Both Azeezah and Abby were peer reviewers, including many others, and those who submitted their experiences to us. So I wanted to get into the report itself, now that people understand how we got here. And so, as I mentioned, one of the key feedback we received from the consultation process was moving away from using a definition approach to anti-Palestinian racism and instead a naming and framing approach. And the importance of that is a framework, is not carved in stone. It really provides the scaffolding in which we talk about the manifestations of anti-Palestinian racism. It really is a starting point to the conversation. It can be adapted and changed to fit the particular context or the community where anti-Palestinian racism occurs. And this matches the feedback that we were getting from the respondents, who had added so many other additional layers of anti-Palestinian racism that they wanted included, but we couldn't necessarily include without making a definition be 2 pages long. Using this approach, it's more inclusive rather than exclusive. We did not want anyone's experiences to be left out if it didn't meet it, it was not included in the definition. The other thing that we learned from our colleagues was, how definitions can be used, in a harmful way or negatively. They've become, very political. They've been used as a distraction. We did not want to engage in a long debate about anti-Palestinian racism's definition. We really wanted to give those on the front line the tools so they can do that work, to have those conversations that reflected their experiences, to validate them and empower them in carrying out this work. we spoke to those who work in critical race theory as well, and they warned us as well about how definitions can be used very narrowly to exclude racist behaviors, or they can use, racist behaviors could be, adapted to avoid being captured by definition. So it was not an end all be all. And many of those in the social justice movement, rightly pointed out, well, you don't need a definition to be able to do that work. Instead, what you really need is to understand the anti-racist and social sort of racism and settler colonialism and those structures of oppression and how it operates. So, this is why we decided to take this approach using a description to make sure that, everyone's experiences were included and people will feel comfortable to take what we have as a starting point and adapt it to their work and their context. So the next point that came up, or the next characteristics that we addressed in the report, was that Palestinians experience a distinct form of racism. And one thing that came up a lot in the conversation was, people, talking about how people will dismiss anti-Palestinian racism and try to capture it under Islamophobia, but they did not feel that Islamophobia really captured their experiences. And while there is connections to Islamophobia, as there is with anti-Arab racism and Orientalism, the experiences of anti-Palestinian racism is distinct, and it needs to be named, understood, and addressed as such. And because the other frameworks don't go far enough to capture those experiences that Palestinians and their advocates experience. And when I talk about advocates, I mean, those who are non-Palestinian but working on issues related to Palestine. We also wanted to address that, racism itself is the appropriate construct to describe our experiences. Israel's treatment of Palestinians, both in occupied territory and in Israel, has now been widely accepted as apartheid, which at its essence is predicated on superiority and dominance of one group of people over another. And that dominance and supremacy is the output, is the racist output of settler colonialism. So we believe that racism is, is the right terminology to describe our experiences. And what we have seen is that, for those who, for Israel's defenders to maintain these structures of racism and oppression, Israel's defenders go to great lengths to justify and defend these racist practices by using tactics that basically, are predicated on the othering of Palestinians and their narratives and their experiences, and really sort of pushing us into what is commonly known into the Palestine exception, which means, while the rights of others are protected, they're not protected for Palestinians. So, for example, in what we see in the university, we hear universities maybe talk, many circumstances talking about being the champions of academic freedom, talking about the importance of academic freedom. But when an academic is attacked for their work on Palestine, the university tends to minimize that experience or side with the attacker. So, these experiences are unique. The Palestine exception is unique to what is happening to Palestinians, both in the private and public sector. And this is why, it is a distinct form of racism. Another key point that came up a lot in the consultation was racism's impact on Palestinians and non-Palestinians. We received a lot of feedback about that, whether or not, anti-Palestinian racism can happen to non-Palestinians. But so we consulted specifically on this point, and the reaction of many Palestinians was that they felt when even non-Palestinians were targeted, they still felt that Palestinians themselves were still the ones who were targeted and impacted by those scandals, even if that person wasn't Palestinian themselves. So many of them felt that, that non-Palestinians can experience anti-Palestinian racism. Many Palestinians view these advocates as part of their Palestinian community and felt that when non-Palestinians were silenced, it was still done for the purpose of protecting settler colonialism on Palestinian lands, which ultimately impacted Palestinians. So, in our report, we determined that anti-Palestinian racism can be experienced by both Palestinians and non-Palestinians, and those perceived to be Palestinian or inherently supportive of Palestinians. However, what we do recognize is that the impacts and consequences of how anti-Palestinian racism is experienced does differ between Palestinians and non-Palestinians, and we need to recognize that Palestinians cannot change their identity, and sometimes their harms can be more profound because they might be in a more precarious position where they work, they might not have the same networks, or even if people sympathize with that person who is Palestinian, they might not be as willing to speak out because the racist tropes that what if there's a grain of truth, what if that person did do something wrong, they don't necessarily, they might not have that confidence to be a vocal supporter, as we see with some others, non-Palestinians who had a lot of people galvanize around them. Another point that I won't be able to go into too deeply, but that came up again in the report, was the impact of intersectionality and anti-Palestinian racism. So what we saw is that, Palestinians or non-Palestinians with additional identities will experience anti-Palestinian racism differently, in which where their other identity might be leveraged in the anti-Palestinian racism. So, for example, queer advocates are considered to be traitors because, if they support Palestinians because of the racist trope that, Palestinians are inherently homophobic. Palestinian and racialized women tend to be, offered to speak in very narrow positions if they are critiquing, or talking about women being oppressed by Palestinian society, because that is a trope that the West is always putting out, that we are inherently backwards, and so on. And what we also noted is that, especially, we've also noticed that that other anti-racist activists, such as those involved in Black Lives Matter, can be subjected to also, very harsh targeting, based on their support of Palestinians, in order to discourage co-solidarities from forming between both anti-racist movements. And we have seen that in the attacks with, Black Lives Matter being labeled as anti-Semitic for their support of Palestinians. So I'm running out of time. This time is going very quickly. So I just want to cover quickly also just the importance of this report and naming anti-Palestinian racism. And the reason why we wanted to call it anti-Palestinian racism and really center it in this report is because we really need to address the erasure and exclusion of Palestinians. Because at its core, anti-Palestinian racism aims to censure and erase Palestinians and their narratives from the public sphere. And it does that through, numerous either punitive measures, or indirectly by eliciting fears of punitive measures for anyone who is sharing these Palestinian narratives, and to deter anyone from sharing Palestinian narratives. These tactics have taken many forms, including defaming a person's character and reputation, falsely accusing them of promoting hate, violence, or anti-Semitism, denying or threatening to deny a person of opportunities or advancements, or dehumanizing Palestinians and negating their experiences, and or portraying Palestinians as an inferior people. So these are sort of the common tactics that are used to silence Palestinians. And, and whenever there is, Palestinians speaking on the issue, there is always that fear of that backlash against those people, against those speakers, and it resulting in a chilling effect on open discourse on Palestine. And, we have heard these stories. I have experienced these stories. My friends and colleagues have experienced, have had these experiences, and we really try to capture that in the report. It is not a new phenomena, but I think we're in a place where we're starting to talk about them more, and they're coming to light a little bit more. One of the deterrences of us speaking about our experiences with anti-Palestinian racism is that there was no recognition of anti-Palestinian racism. We were told it was a political difference, or that our views were controversial, or, nothing could be done, or it's in your best interest to keep silence, don't bring it up, you will harm your career if you do. So what happened was many of us who experienced it, even those of us in positions of privilege, including lawyers, we shied away from going public with a lot of our experiences, and instead we try to use a legal framework to justify our positions. But as we all know, laws have very big limitations when it comes to Palestine. It is a very conservative approach, and stems from systems of oppressions themselves. So this report really aims to change this, by putting together this framework through a consultative approach, getting feedback, putting in the resources, outlining how the framework of anti-Palestinian racism manifests. We hope that, people will feel confident about speaking on anti-Palestinian racism, and we can start eliminating the self-doubt, the fear and isolation that many of us feel when working on Palestine. This is definitely a bottom-down, user-centered and direct approach that we are trying to encapsulate and empower through this project. I'm not going to go into any of these in great detail, but I just wanted to point out that when using the description, it is not exhaustive. So if you don't see your context expressed there, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be included. It should be addressed. This is an anti-oppression tool. Again, it should be used in your work, in your context. It is a starting point for conversations. It is not a response to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It was never intended as that. It's really about telling our narratives. And again, we have learned a lot of lessons from what happened with the IHRA definition. So, we're not looking for this to be used as a weapon. Again, it is a narrative sharing empowerment tool for our community so we can talk about our experiences. So when we go into the report, again, we have a whole section around the harms of anti-Palestinian racism. It goes into a lot of detail of how we have experienced anti-Palestinian racism and the impact on us, both personally and professionally. So we did not just want it to, talk about the framework, but we also wanted to talk about the real racial trauma that many of us experience in doing this work. So there's a whole section there that encapsulate what racial trauma looks like and how it is experienced. There's also a section specifically about what is happening on campuses, how, the experiences of both students and educators, and how different academic institutions have been used to silence, silence Palestinian advocates. And lastly, we have included some steps about what can be done with this report, and some suggestions about how you can use it as an empowering tool, which maybe if we have time in the Q&A, we can go into it and I can explain why I used a dandelion as the image for that. But really, we want people to use this in their work, to share it with those who you think need to see it, share it with your networks, to have conversations about it, train one another, in its context, to be able to have conversations, feel comfortable about speaking about anti-Palestinian racism, educate your own, your own environments, your school boards, your professors, your, HR diversity departments, your politicians, your local media, it's your community groups, etc. And we've also created an online self-reporting tool for people to report anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism. It's on our website. So again, this tool is just about, sharing your experiences with us for data purposes, data collection, because we do not have the resources to address every one of these incidences. But by telling your story, we can use those experiences to continue our work. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm so over time.
Not to worry at all, Dania. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. This is Dania's first time kind of giving us a public full presentation of the report. So thank you, Dania. I know that it's not always easy to do that for the first time, but that was phenomenal and really insightful. And I guess it didn't really click the time period of everything going on in Gaza and Quds, and the delay, I guess, that the report had to undergo in the whole process, and just even like finding it in you to restart again after all that. So thank you. Okay, so a really quick overview of our structure for tonight. We're going to have two wonderful respondents to Dania, Azeezah and Abigail, and we're going to take a short break and then return for some Q&A after. So I will be introducing our next speaker, Azeezah Kanji, who is a legal academic and a writer. She's received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and a Master's of Law specializing in Islamic law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Azeezah's work focuses on issues relating to racism, law, and social justice. Her writing has appeared in Azeezah, English, Hearts, Toronto Star, Truth Out, National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Open Democracy, Roar Magazine, iPolitics, Policy Options, Rebel, and various academic anthologies and journals. Azeezah also serves as the Director of Programming at the Noor Cultural Center, and we are so grateful for your time, Azeezah, so thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you to the organizers. It is such an honor to be here with Dania and with Abby to discuss the beautiful work of this beautiful report with two people whose long history of work I know is such a beacon of light for many of us involved in social justice struggles. So thank you for that. As the introduction at the beginning reminded us, we are having this conversation about the colonial racism against Palestinians on land that is itself colonized Indigenous land. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, with the current treaty holders being the Mississaugas of New Credit. And all across this land that currently calls itself Canada, we know that Indigenous nations continue to confront the many faces of genocidal and colonial violence of the Canadian state, whether the quick violence of a police bullet or the slower violence of poisoning of waters and lands. And so we hold these land and water defenders in our hearts, in our minds, and in our solidarities. We also hold in our consciousness all of those Indigenous, racialized, marginalized peoples whose lands and natural resources, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog in the background is trying to get into the conversation, but we hold in our consciousness all of those Indigenous, racialized, marginalized peoples whose lands and natural resources continue to be depredated in the production of the information technology that is allowing us to have this conversation with each other today, and who, in our context of climate apartheid, continue to experience disproportionately the brunt of the effects of emissions generated by these types of Zoom discussions that we are having, which are often understood as being existing in virtual space, disconnected from material processes of dispossession and violence against peoples and lands. These so-called land acknowledgements that we engage in at the beginnings of discussions are not simply a quick stopping point that we check off before proceeding to the true substance of the conversation. Rather, they are an essential reminder, a vital reminder that when we are talking about racism in places like Canada, we are not simply talking about individual aberrations irrationalities or extremisms. Rather, we are talking about logic that has been deeply embedded in the structure of settler states like Canada, and that despite all of the pretensions of having overcome colonialism in our quote unquote post-colonial world, that these colonial racisms continue to impel and animate operations of violent domination, dispossession, and exploitation from Turtle Island to Palestine. As the scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf wrote, quote, "Race is a trace of history. Colonized populations continue to be racialized in specific ways that mark out and reproduce the unequal relationships into which Europeans and those descended from Europeans have co-opted these populations." It is particularly vital for us to remember this intimate relationship between racism and colonialism in our current moment, in which states, settler states like Canada, are assiduously attempting to erase their colonial character and colonial foundations in order to represent themselves as the solution to racism, when in fact they are the source. Before our eyes, we are witnessing the expansion and entrenchment of tools of state racism in the name of countering private white supremacism, whether it be the federal online harms proposal, which supposedly in the name of combating online hate threatens to further intensify the censorship, surveillance, and policing of Palestinian, Black, Indigenous, Muslim, and other colonized and racialized people's speech, whether it be the provincial Our London Family Act in Ontario, which again in the supposed name of controlling white supremacist rallies is providing the government with tools that from recent and longer history we know will first and foremost be used to target rallies and other displays of solidarity with Palestinians. Whether it be the expansion of the terrorist entities list, which in the supposed name of making it now ostensibly colorblind by including a few white supremacist groups on it, continues to be wielded to disproportionately, overwhelmingly target Muslims, Palestinians, Kashmiris, and other people confronting the terror of the colonial states to which they are subjected to. By continuously erasing these colonial foundations and character of the Canadian state, Canada is representing itself as the solution to racial violence when in fact it is the source. And so, as Muslims confronting Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, we are now perhaps maybe under tightly controlled parameters permitted to talk about the cold-blooded shooting of Muslims in a mosque in Quebec, or the cold-blooded mowing down of a Muslim family while out on a walk in London, Ontario. But you better dare not talk about the state policies, practices, and ideologies that have ratified the devaluation, demonization, and disposability of Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, Black, and Indigenous life, not occurring in the public spaces of a mosque or on the street, but largely behind closed doors, sequestered behind walls of secrecy and impunity. You better not talk about the casualties of Canada's mass incarceration, prison, and policing system, whether it be Abdurrahman Abdi, who was killed in the street by Ottawa police, Ijaz Chaudhry killed in his own home by Peel police, Soliman Fakiri beat to death by guards in an Ontario jail. You better not talk about the victims of Canada's complicity in torture, Hassan Diab, Mohammed Harkat, Abdurrahman Banasawi, Mohammed Slahi, to mention just a few of the current ongoing cases. You better not talk about the largely invisibilized casualties and victims of Canada's foreign policy of supporting atrocities through silence and arms deals, whether it be the Kashmiris being strangulated by India or the Yemenis being slaughtered by Saudi Arabia. And you certainly better not talk about Palestine. But we need to talk about Palestine. We need to talk about everything that I've been mentioning, but we need to talk about Palestine because understanding the apparatuses of violence that have been developed to dispossess Palestinians, and the ideological apparatuses of racism developed in order to rationalize and justify these violences, we need to understand the ongoing Nakba, the Nakba upon Nakba to which the Palestinians have been subjected, the most recent instantiation of which is the Israeli court's authorization of the expulsion of 1,000 Palestinians from Masafar Yatta in the West Bank. We need to understand these apparatuses of anti-Palestinian violence and the anti-Palestinian racism developed to justify it, because understanding this is essential for understanding the way that state violence operates and continues to inflict casualties in our context of colonial modernity, in our colonial present. Israel, itself having been informed in the construction of its apartheid system by Canada's anti-Indigenous apartheid system on these lands via the example of apartheid South Africa, Israel, having been informed by these global methodologies of colonization and apartheid, has now become, has the damning distinction of serving as an innovator and exporter of the social, legal, and technological modalities of colonial violence in the quote-unquote global war on terror. Whether it be by the export of weaponry that Israel sells and advertises as having been battle tested on Palestinians for use against civilian populations around the world, whether it be by the development of legal and judicial justifications and precedents for extrajudicial killing and torture, whether it be by the development of the very category of the terrorist itself, which very conveniently for states enables them to produce a category of people who may be subject to almost unlimited violence while being precluded from using any legitimate violence in return. From the indigenous nations under siege from Standing Rock to Unistoten, to the Kashmiris and people in East Turkestan who are in the open air prison camps that have been built there, to those who have been imprisoned in the closed air prison camp of Guantanamo Bay. So thank you, Dania and the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association for producing this wonderful and powerful report that enables us to systematically understand within a framework that is academically rigorous and responsive to community needs, that enables us to understand this foundational phenomenon of anti-Palestinian racism. And while we are here to launch and honor this report, I also want to honor and celebrate Dania for providing not only a report that is substantively rigorous and beautiful, but also showing us how to do this work in a beautiful way. So often in our struggles of social justice, we end up internalizing and reproducing and mirroring the very colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal ways of doing work that we are trying to resist, projecting authoritarianism rather than authority, working in non-collaborative and competitive ways. And so I think what Dania has done for us here is really provided us with an exemplar for how to do social justice work in a socially just way. So thank you for that, Dania, and I'm looking forward to continuing to think together with all of you who are here with us today and all of whom we will continue to be in conversation with in the future about how we advance our struggles for justice, including by using this report. Salam, everyone. Greetings of peace.
Thank you so much, Azeezah. It's now a pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend and someone else who I've been working with for about a year and learned so much from. Abigail Bakan is professor in the Department of Social Justice and Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Cross-appointed to the Department of Political Science and an affiliate with the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research is in the area of anti-oppression politics, with a focus on intersections of gender, race, class, political economy, and citizenship. With Yasmin Abulaban, she is author of Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, Exploring Identity and Power in a Global Context. Other publications include Ideology and Class, Conflict in Jamaica, The Politics of Rebellion, and Theorizing Anti-Racism, Linkages in Marxism and Critical Race Theory, co-edited with Inakshi Dua. She serves on the National Board of the United Jewish People's Order and is a member of the Jewish Faculty Network. It's a pleasure to hear you speak, Abby.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? We're good? Yeah. So there's so much to acknowledge and so much to recognize here. Thank you, Azeezah, for reminding us about the linkages with the land. It's really a pleasure to share this panel with you and with Dania. Thank you, Dania. What an outstanding summary and sharing of such a complex and detailed report with such care and passion. Thank you, Hearing Palestine. I've watched this initiative emerge at the University of Toronto and beyond. Alejandro and Lina, this is just a remarkable accomplishment. And the Healthcare Workers Alliance of Palestine, that, am I getting the name right? Najib, it's such a pleasure to share this opportunity to welcome this report. So this important report titled Anti-Palestinian Racism, Naming, Framing, and Manifestations. This is I think we're at a little bit of a turning point here for this to be helping this report go public. The detailed, careful analysis that the report presents for those of us who are involved in advocating for Palestinian rights, to be able to have a vocabulary and a documentation that explicitly identifies and therefore allows us to challenge anti-Palestinian racism is an incredible gift. And thank you to all of you who had a part in helping to make this this come to fruition. And the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association has just taken remarkable leadership in this. I think this opens space to imagine Palestine solidarity and Palestine studies, certainly in terms of curriculum studies, differently, with more confidence, with more breadth. Of course, we have to challenge the weight, the heavy, terrifying weight of constant anti-Palestinian racism, but also by naming it, it allows us to open doors to imagine the richness and creative potential of what is Palestine and the Palestinian experience. So I just am feeling quite overwhelmed with gratitude to be able to be a part of this. I feel very humbled. It's also really wonderful to see the documentation of the events that happened at the law school. And the role that the Canadian Association of University Teachers played, the background to the report. We have to learn these lessons. We did actually push back. There was a movement among us at Central UofT that pushed back, and we were able to ultimately force the university to extend an offer to Azarova, to Valentina Azarova. But we need to know it was kind of a bittersweet victory, and we have to keep moving in this direction. So as Dania has mentioned, I had the opportunity to share in a comment on an earlier draft with my colleague and co-author Yasmin Abulaban. So what I want to share for you here are just really two highlights of the report, that I think are particular strengths. There are many more. One is regarding the Palestine exception that Dania mentioned in our educational system particularly, and the other is about what this report can mean in terms of building solidarity across difference. So the report clearly indicates how anti-Palestinian racism, we have a new acronym, APR, I love this, serves to, one of the manifestations is erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians. And another is excluding or pressuring others to exclude the Palestinian perspective and Palestinians and their allies. The erasure and the exceptionalism that we refer to as the Palestine exception is so widespread. It's common across political views, left and right. It takes place in multiple arenas: civil society, the educational system, K to 12, the university system. It takes place professionally at every job interview, at every moment of, thinking about media or public work. It's a constant censoring. And to be able to name this is really a breakthrough. In my own discipline, the discipline of political science, I work in both education and political science. It's a field dedicated to the study of states and power. In a certain sense, Palestine is right within the remit of the discipline. But Palestinians have been rendered stateless because of Israel's state actions as a settler colonial state. And so the absenting of the state renders Palestinians outside the purview of studying states. And then Israel is seen as exceptional because it claims to be a Jewish state, which has no global comparators. And the result is this continual loop of, what Charles Mills has called an epistemology of ignorance. So it's not just an absence of information or an absence of facts. It's an active process of absenting and rendering ignorance about the reality of Palestinians. And how are we to call this? What are we to name it? Again, following Charles Mills, Yasmin Abulabin and I have used the framework of the racial contract, an unnamed but widely understood process whereby Palestinian lives, experiences, history, rights, contributions, knowledge, realities are simply erased from global knowledge. So we know how this is how racism works in colonial settler contexts. So naming anti-Palestinian racism is really, really important and effective in moving a step away from the Palestine exception, and this is important. So the second point I want to talk about is solidarity across difference. So anti-Palestinian racism, like all racisms in the current era, is often coded. It's a racism that will not call its own name. And that coding takes various forms. And I want to deal particularly with one coding, which is where anti-Palestinian racism is justified on grounds of claiming that another racism is happening, i.e. anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an imperfect term. Here I'm referring to it as anti-Jewish racism. So there's no minimizing anti-Jewish racism. It goes through different forms and different times at different places. I am Jewish. My family is no stranger to anti-Semitism. But I, like many, have been horrified at the way in which the pain of one population has been appropriated and used to justify constant and ongoing refusal to acknowledge the pain of another and actively work to silence and to cultivate it. There's a material background to this, the cold, hard materiality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian indigenous land, the violence and ongoing dispossession of Palestinians, the collaboration of major states like Canada and the United States with the suppression of Palestinian rights, the role of civil society organizations that claim to represent Jewish communities internationally in reproducing this, serves to work towards this coding, this horrible, painful coding of anti-Palestinian racism in specific forms. So many of us have tried to refuse this dangerous collapsing. It's an uphill battle. We have had some successes in pushing back the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism on our campuses. And much of this work has been exhausting and painful work because we feel like we're just fighting to keep, the tsunami away from the land. But we're also welcoming of various shores of community and waters of joy because there are new communities of resistance that are forming, and we're stronger when we help each other and when we resist the divide and conquer tactics that are so finely tuned by the experts of the defenders of colonialism and capitalism and neoliberalism and so many forms of oppressive practices. So in advancing this movement, we have increasingly found the terrain of definitions is a subject of conversation. In the movement to challenge the IHRA working definition and its various examples, many of us have found ourselves watching how the State of Israel and its advocates have pressed for definitional fiat, have tried to create this narrow conception of a definition only with the goal of insisting that if there is a challenge to the State of Israel, which has usurped the Jewish star on its flag, that has to be identified with anti-Semitism. So the slipperiness of definitions in something that is as malleable as racism and anti-racism becomes sort of a fraught terrain. And the report and its methodology, its careful consultation, the review, the shared conversations that are reported really has been helpful in terms of helping all of us understand the limits and the potential of how we discuss this and how we name and frame forms of racism. So understanding the particularities and details of anti-Palestinian racism, naming and framing it, embracing the acronym of APR, understanding this as a description, understanding that what we need to do is find bonds of solidarity. This is an immense contribution to the potential for liberation of cross communities, including among Palestinian and Jewish communities. So thank you, ACLA. Thank you, Dania. Thank you here in Palestine. Thank you for those of you who are attending today. Please download the report, give it a read, and think of it as a gift that you can walk away from, and all the ways in which we can continue this struggle and this movement together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby, for the wonderful presentation and for your support that is always principled and consistent. And yeah, we're just really grateful to have you at UofT and to be a part of this. Okay, so I think our speakers are gonna probably need a little break to go through the Q&A and make sure that we're selecting the questions that we're gonna answer. We'll take maybe 5 minutes. In the meantime, I do want you guys to send in any questions that you might have through the Q&A function. And we wanted to also give you an opportunity to suggest or I guess communicate with us any particular actions that make use of the report or any other strategies that we might be able to kind of put together to address anti-Palestinian racism and your personal experiences with them. So essentially, what kinds of services do you need? What kinds of ideas do you have? What ways do you think the report would benefit you? Yeah, so feel free to throw in just those suggestions, or if you have a particular question for our speakers. We will call everyone back at 7:48, okay? Thank you all so much. Okay, we are back. Just wait for Dania Majid whenever you guys are ready. Hello. I hope that was enough of a break. I know lawyers probably don't get breaks ever. You guys just kind of have to push through events all the time. Yeah, okay. Okay, so there's a number of questions that came in, and I'm sure you guys are still working through the rest of them. But Alejandro, did you want to maybe get started with one of the questions, and then we can kind of go back and forth?
Sure, thanks. I'm also going to put some suggestions that folks put in the Q&A and post them in the chat. So Maha asks, I'm curious about the choice to use the word racism as opposed to bigotry or prejudice. Racism seems to imply that Palestinians are a distinct race. Sorry, just went somewhere else.
Oh, I'm
Okay.
sorry, Alejandro. I published it. My apologies.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Racism seems to imply that Palestinians are a distinct race, yet Palestinians generally don't see themselves as a distinct race. Are there legal or other implications to using the term racism specifically? Maybe we can start with Dania and then Azeezah and Abby. If you have other comments, feel free to join.
So the short answer is, and we did address this in the report, is we have, like, in anti-racism discourse, when, you know, I was doing a lot of the reading and research, those working on racism have moved beyond sort of a identity-based or skin-based type descriptor of race, and are now talking about racism in terms of structures of oppression, and those who are impacted by those structures of oppression. So, and because many of those structures, such as settler colonialism, one of the outputs of that structure, or the way you can maintain that structure of oppression, is through racism, where you benefit, or sort of the dominant power is sort of benefiting by, making another group of people inferior and having them serve the, sort of the needs and the structures of that dominant power. So not just with Palestinians, it's we're seeing the term racism used for other groups as well to describe those experiences within a society. So that's sort of my short answer.
Azeezah and Abigail, my apologies. Feel free to jump in and follow up if you would like.
I completely 100% agree with Dania. And we know with Muslims too, we constantly hear this argument that Muslims are a race and therefore Muslims can't be subjected to racism, which is really just a way of perpetually deferring any real conversation or action on the very real structures of state violence that continues to subject Muslims to torture, expulsion, and death. I think it's important to say racism as opposed to bigotry, because bigotry suggests an individual level of animus, whereas racism calls attention to the state structures and institutional structures that are subjecting people to harm. And so I think it's very important that this is identified as anti-Palestinian racism, not simply anti-Palestinian bigotry.
I agree. I don't have anything to add at this point. I'll
Thank you,
indicate my strong agreement with Dania and Azeezah.
Okay, so this question, I also was thinking about it. So maybe we'll do this one next. I wonder, maybe this is to Dania and Azeezah specifically, our legal scholars, but will the report be embraced in the legal community to the extent that it would have some leverage, I guess, in legal proceedings, whether it's in courts or the Human Rights Commission or whatever it may be, Human Rights Tribunal, I feel like I think I was having a discussion about how Islamophobia first emerged at this like idea that it's even a thing, 10 or 15 years ago. And now it's like a really, it's a real like principle that can be discussed in legal spaces, and, it's a distinct recognized experience. So I'm wondering if that's the goal of the report, or if this is something a little bit different.
Well, I mean, we didn't have like a specific output in mind when we created the report. It really is designed to be a resource for the user to use it as they see fit, with, to meet the needs that they have at that, in a particular context or a particular time. So, for example, there, there was a question as well that, related to this, about it being accepted by the legal community, and how that would work, because there's a lot of diversity initiatives happening within the legal community. What are the hopes that our law society would, for instance, accept it? Now, because the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association is part of the Law Society, and we sit on equity advisory groups, we will do our best to highlight this report in our work. But I will say that it is a very hostile space, even within the diversity groups that sit on the Law Society, who we sit with. So we are part of a lot of diversity organizations or groupings where we deal with issues around diversity in the profession. And whenever we try to raise our issues around anti-Palestinian racism, and not just that, even Islamophobia, it's very difficult to get any support from the other diversity groups. We hear a lot of things that, it's controversial. I mean, we couldn't even get a statement out on the Quebec mosque massacre. We couldn't get even anyone to to sign a letter we were trying to put together on that. Same thing around Dr. Azeezah. There was very little discussion about what happened at UofT Law School, despite the fact that we are, lawyers, and many of us graduated from UofT, and many of us appear before judges. And you would have thought this would have been front page news in the legal papers, and it was not. So I think we do have a long way to go in terms of, bringing attention to the, to get the legal profession at least to pay attention to our experiences and take them seriously. We will push, but we've been pushing since we started the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, and we've been met with a very big brick wall. I'm hoping this report will help a little bit in that regard. But to your question about the legal, its use in legal proceedings, yes, this report, like other reports, can be used in legal proceedings. If whoever's bringing complainant, they can cite it in their work. So it can be used as a tool in that way. So if you are looking at a human rights complaint or some other, employment, labor, union related complaint where, you are experiencing some type of legal challenge where anti-Palestinian racism may arise, you could potentially use this report. And I've been told at least one person I know has or is intending to use it in that capacity because of a situation they're going through. And I expect others will as well.
So just thinking about the analogy with Islamophobia that you mentioned, Lina, courts have been so resistant to any acknowledgement or recognition of Islamophobia. The judge in the Quebec mosque shooting case held that Alexandra Bissonnette's shooting of Muslims in a mosque was not quote unquote terrorism because it was the result of just individual pathologies on his part and not any kind of structural issue. Even when human rights commissions have acknowledged or recognized that Islamophobia was at issue in certain state actions, courts have overturned those decisions. courts have discarded expert witnesses on Islamophobia by saying that the fact that we now have shows like Little Mosque in the Prairie in Canada shows that Islamophobia is not actually an issue in Canada, and that claims that, for example, the fact that the terrorist entities list is predominantly populated by Muslims as well as Palestinians does not prove Islamophobia. They've purportedly refuted this by saying that, well, it's only 3/4 Muslim, not 100%, and therefore we don't have Islamophobia issue. And so what this is to say is that the primary terrain of struggle is really among us. It's among activists, it's among academics, it's among all of those expressing solidarity with Palestine. Eventually, inshallah, courts will reflect that work that we have done to make anti-Palestinian racism visible and acknowledgeable. We know for Black and Indigenous communities how much work, how much activism, how much resistance it has taken to get even a basic acknowledgement of these endemic forms of racism by Canadian courts. And so the legal terrain is one terrain of struggle, but it's one that will be influenced and shaped by all of the work that we do outside of it.
Yeah, just to build on that, the courts are very conservative. They're not places of change. So I echo Azeezah that it is us as who are the change makers. The judges, the judges are not the change makers themselves. We have to push them, and it's do that work to get to that place of change.
Maybe I'll just add a point here that academic institutions are also very conservative. We find our little pockets where we can, we can try to advocate as we do, but there is a huge amount of resistance. And another form of advocacy, just following along the same lines that Azeezah and Dania have said, is citation practices. So this report is a published report that is scrupulously researched. It has an extensive list of links and sources. And, for any of us who are scholars, for anyone who is here who's a student, if you have opportunities in your classroom, to just encourage, give this published document airspace and encourage research that uses it and cites it and sees it as part of the literature. And it doesn't mean people have to agree with it. They can say, I don't think this is anti-Palestinian racism, but you can't ignore it without dealing with it. You can't simply silence it because it's a legitimate, important publication. So I think it's something that, just like legal advocacy, there's intellectual advocacy, there's scholarly advocacy, there's advocacy on the ground. The report is only a living document if we use it, and I also see it as a work in progress. A year from now, it might be something we have another conversation about. There may be changes that occur, and we can build on it. And that's also part of how ideas change, and we practice. We practice using these experiences, but it's a huge contribution that it exists, with a binding and a cover, and we can build on that.
I just want to second that. Cite it, use it. This, I think, is such a rare example of something that brings together a theoretically rigorous academic framework on understanding racism and colonialism with deep community knowledge of experiences and violences that have been experienced. And Abby talked about this epistemology of ignorance, which is not simply an absence of knowledge, but the active production of narratives and ignorance in order to justify violence. And the way that we change that is by changing the terrain of what's considered knowledge, what's considered authoritative, by bringing something like this anti-Palestinian racism report into the canons of citation. So I just wanted to wholeheartedly second what Abby said.
Thank you, Azeezah. I also think that, as a student at UofT, I really wish that I saw more Palestinian thinkers and intellectuals and academics, because I was really curious and intrigued and I wanted to learn more. And there was just like this complete lack and deficiency in what I thought was a very rich and substantive and prestigious, academic institution. And U of T certainly is in so many ways, but I think that when it comes to Palestine, we're really lacking, really lacking. And I think that is the case for much of Canada. Najib, please go ahead if you have a question.
I just want to add something about, unfortunately, I think medicine takes the dubious honor of being the most conservative of all. And so just recognizing the word anti-Palestinian within academic medicine and clinical medicine has been a challenge just at that level. So I think just recognizing it, naming it is very important. But also just wanted to point out to everyone that, as was talked about earlier by Azeezah and others about the land acknowledgement, we all have to be very careful about performative. Everybody's into the performative. And just by certain, I think, mainstream or academic institutions recognizing certain things does not necessarily mean that change is coming. And I think a lot of it has to do with power differentials. And I think the more people work together to rock the boat and sort of undermine that differential and that power, the more meaningful these things can become and the more meaningful the work that we do can become. Because we can see a lot of examples of this happening, from land acknowledgements to other things all the time. I mean, somebody mentioned about the Black Lives Matter. A lot of it has been recognized, but really on the ground, what has changed in any significant way, from policing to carding to others? Not a whole lot, but things are changing. So I think grassroots work and linking between different groups and different capacities is going to still be a very important work to do for a long time to come.
So, thank you, Najib. There's a couple of questions about the intersection or the conflation of anti-Palestinian racism with Islamophobia. So maybe we'll turn to those. Mona asks, can you please comment on how Islamophobia is commonly conflated with anti-Palestinian racism? What are some of the implications? And then Ahmed writes, I appreciate the comments about the need for a distinct definition and framework for anti-Palestinian racism that is separate and apart from Islamophobia. But how do we reconcile that with the very real and frequent intersections of APR and Islamophobia that is often leveraged by the colonial state to delegitimize Palestinian resistance? For example, the frequent incursions into the Al-Aqsa compound, pinkwashing, and so on. So, again, take it as you will.
So, on the conflation piece, again, there's a section in the report that describes that in a little bit more detail. And, so like Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism can happen at the same time, or one can be used, sort of to leverage the other or against the other. So we don't have to see them as two separate piles. Something can be both anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobic. And we do see that overlap, because some of those tropes for both Muslims and Palestinians apply at the same time. But what the concern is, at least one of the main concerns expressed to us when we were speaking to Palestinians, is that when they raise anti-Palestinian racism, instead of talking about anti-Palestinian racism, the institution they're speaking with changes the subject and only wants to talk to them about Islamophobia and a safe version of, like, this societally accepted version of Islamophobia. One that does not account for their experiences as a Palestinian. So, we have seen that, for example, in the Dr. Azarova case. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association wrote a complaint expressing our concern with the Conduct of Justice Bureau and his conduct, which we said was, racist against Palestinians. And we were concerned about the harms to those who are Palestinians or might be, speaking on Palestine or have an issue related to Palestine. When we filed the judicial review, we got disclosure. And in that disclosure, it was revealed that the tax court, seeing the public newspaper articles about the conduct of Justice Spiro, maybe seeing our own complaint, decided to ban him from hearing any cases involving Muslims. Now, I mean, this is actually just a completely bizarre and, I would also say Islamophobic type of response. However, it does, by taking this weird measure, no one, including the Canadian Judicial Council who wrote their decision about, our complaint, or the tax court, acknowledged Palestinians and the harms to Palestinians by Justice Spiro's conduct. Instead, they gave us weird comments about Muslims, inappropriate comments about Muslims, not so much weird, but inappropriate responses, which is barring Justice Spiro from hearing cases involving Muslims. And the CJC telling us we shouldn't be, no right-thinking person should be concerned that he has bias against Palestinians because he has quintessentially Muslim friends. But again, our concerns about Palestinians were ignored. Now, we have seen this happen from diversity offices, same thing, parents, community groups, academics talk about anti-Palestinian racism, and the response is, okay, we'll give you, we'll tell you what we're doing on Islamophobia. Great, I'm happy you are taking care about, and doing something on Islamophobia, but we need to talk about the specific issues Palestinians or advocates of Palestine are facing. And using this conflation, it's another way to silence Palestinians and those experiences, which is something that we are concerned about, and which is why we called it out in the report.
Azeezah or Abby, did you have any extra comments on your question? Or Najib?
Again, very, very much 100% agree with Dania. And I think a large part of the problem is with this vitiated concept of Islamophobia that we have in the first place, which reduces it to a question of private violence committed by extremists like Alexandra Bissonnette, for example, and abstracts it utterly from any discussion of state violence, of material violence, of institutions and structures, of long histories of colonial violence that long predate 9/11, even though Islamophobia is often represented as a response to Muslim violence rather than a cause of tremendous amounts of violence against Muslims around the world. For example, Dania and I, we both served on the Ontario Province's Anti-Racism Directorate before it was completely enervated by the Ford government, and there, they had their 4 committees, one on anti-Indigenous racism, one on anti-Black racism, one on anti-Semitism, and one on Islamophobia. No room whatsoever to talk about anti-Palestinian racism. Every time it was raised, it was completely ignored. And so this reduction of Islamophobia to a question of private violence, and then the conflation of Muslims with Arabs, with Palestinians, is a way of dissociating Islamophobia from ongoing projects of state violence against Palestinians who are simply collapsed into the category of Muslim, against Black Muslims who are taken out of the category of Muslim altogether, rendering anti-Black Islamophobia invisible. When it comes to Black Muslims, we know how vital it is to appreciate the intersections of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia when it comes to structuring violent exercises of state power, like police killings, like cardings, which then subject Black Muslims to denial of security certifications in ways that are very particularly related to intersections of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia. And so similarly, we have to appreciate the specificities and individualities of anti-Palestinian racism emerging from the particularities of Israel's settler colonial project against Palestinians, and know that this isn't mutually exclusive with or collapsible into the category of Islamophobia, but rather intersects with it. And I think that's the kind of more complex, robust anti-racist, anti-colonial analysis that is called for.
Absolutely. I'm always like really like just taken back by how hard it is for people to see a distinction between a Palestinian and then just like an Arab Muslim in general. Like when I talk about armed resistance in Egypt in the 60s or the 70s, everybody's like super casual about it. We're in class, we're having a discussion, it's no big deal, you know, Suez Canal, all that stuff. But if somebody were to talk about like the Intifada around the same time, there would be like this hyper scrutinizing attitude and tensions, and all these like tropes start working on. And the you know, the distinction is like starkly clear to me. And yeah, so I think it's really, really important that the report is kind of working to clarify that. Alejandro or Najib, I believe.
No, I think, yeah, okay, go ahead, Najib, and then I think Abigail also.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead first.
I think it's very important to bring it back to a bit to the political realm as well, because this is a long-standing issue. Clearly, pre-existing strong Islamophobia in the West is being leveraged against the Palestinians. There's no question about it. But also, there's a long history of reducing the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli-Arab conflict to a religious issue.
Mm-hmm.
So when you bring forward the Islamophobia issue, the answer is, well, we can have Israel and then you can just have people pray at the mosque. You have rights to prayer, rights to individual religious rights. But that's clearly not what the Palestinians are asking for. They're asking for national liberation, which is very different. So this is ironically, the Islamophobia that exists and is real is somehow used to justify ignoring the other part, to render the whole conflict into a religious conflict on that level. And then the answer to that would be individual religious rights, which would solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Although the Al-Aqsa Mosque is obviously a very symbolic to all Palestinians, I think not just the Muslim Palestinians, but clearly trying to reduce it to that issue is also not, you know, have to be careful about that, because for a lot of Palestinians, going back to their hometown where their parents grew up and where they want to live as refugees is equally important to Al-Aqsa Mosque and not less important. And last but not least, I think the whole process also diminishes how real Islamophobia is, and again reduces that one as well to some basic, you know, you can pray, you can have a prayer room in the hospital and a prayer room at the university, and really again takes away the issue of political rights and equality in that realm. So I think that's very, very important to be very careful about, in addition to trying to always create these divisions within Palestinians between, well, we'll let the Christians go to their, you know, church a bit better than the Muslims, and so create that sort of subgroup type of division to create problems for Palestinians to try to be together and sort of resist and work towards their national liberation. So that's, I think, very important.
Thanks, Najib.
I'll just pop in here on, yeah, this is it's a discussion that has so many levels that are like at the individual level and also national and international. So the World Conference Against Racism that originally took place in 2001 in Durban developed the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which was a consensus process that the Canadian government at the time signed on to. But Israel and the United States walked out on the grounds that it was a quote unquote anti-Semitic hate fest, which under the Harper Tories eventually was coined by Jason Kenney as a term. And Canada since then has refused to participate in any of the review conferences, including the 20-year anniversary that just took place in 2021 and that Trudeau refused to participate. Why was all this controversy? Because the word Palestine is mentioned 2 times in the Durban Declaration, 2 times, as well as anti-Semitism and all other forms of racism. And every time there has been a global conference around racism, the issue of Palestine has been the grounds on which Israel and sometimes the United States walk out. And the phenomenon, it's very clear that there is anti-Palestinian racism at a global level, because the idea is we are going to cover it up. We are not going to name this. And the argument is whenever the word Palestine enters into the international arena, the state that is implicated is Israel, which claims to be a Jewish state, which means it's automatically anti-Semitic. It is itself a racist trope, but even a conference against racism, which clearly Canada could use, you know, some help with, I mean, becomes controversial simply because just the name Palestine is included in the context of all sorts of other things in a very, you know, non-confrontational manner. I mean, it really is just a question of international policy and international law being recognized. And we see this over and over again. I mean, you know, at the individual case around Valentina Azarova, which we've mentioned, this is a human rights lawyer. You'd think in a program on human rights, you'd think if you're talking about everyone who's human, Palestinians should not be controversial to be included in the framework of human rights. But that was the issue around which the controversy took place. It was the maintenance that human rights apply to Palestinians on a global scale. It's a subject of international law. That was the issue. So yes, it has a lot to do with every other form of racism, anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, and so on. But there is something very, very specific that the other side knows how to target. And it's really important for it to be named, for it to be something that we can struggle on.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, I think the international, like the role of international bodies in general is really interesting. We had Professor Erdiemsis and Renda Senora from the Women's Center for Legal Aid in Jerusalem, hosted them, I think it was in our fall term. We talked a lot about like the role of international law and international like tribunals and committees and things like that in being complacent or in perpetuating. It's on our YouTube channel. I'll put the link in the description if you're interested. But yeah, absolutely. The global system is stark. Okay, so we have, I think, time for one last question. Thank you to our speakers for your patience and engagement so far. So there's a lot of questions on the intersectionality between Islamophobia and different forms of discrimination and racism and anti-Palestinian racism. So we can continue our conversation on that. Or we can shift a little bit to talk about the goal of the reporting tool, Dania, that the ACLA has put together. There is a question here that asks if people who experience APR in their community or in their workplace should use the tool to report it, and they can rely on it to also request legal action or support. I know that there's a very clear disclaimer against this, but it'd be good to have a little bit of a conversation about it. Or is this just like a data collection method?
Yeah, for the sake of time, I'll keep it short. And right now we only have the capacity to use it for data collection, to collect the stories, so we know how to further our advocacy. Part of the reason for this initiative is because no one is collecting this information, not that I'm aware of, at least in Canada. Anti-Palestinian racism or anti-Arab racism it's not counted, so therefore it doesn't exist. So the hope is, you know, if people want to send in their stories, we'll keep track of it. And when we do our advocacy, we'll at least have this information at hand, and you know, might be able to identify who are the problematic players and maybe where we need to do, you know, direct some of our resources towards addressing particular, you know, a particular space. Or how do we empower the community who are, you know, to do that work themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the lack of data, I think this is like an excellent first step, and it gives people a way of like articulating it, and you know, there's a bit of a narrative forming, which is wonderful. Okay, so we are approaching.
Azeezah, did you want to add something, and Abby?
Oh.
To that answer?
I had one little thing I wanted to add.
My apologies, Abby.
As
Go ahead.
we're coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to make a note about the dandelion. So Dan, you can elaborate that, but when Azeezah and myself and Dania were chatting in anticipation of this discussion, Dania made reference to thinking of this as sort of like a the report is like a dandelion where you can blow on the white little puffy flowers and it spreads around, and people might think of this as a weed, but it's actually a beautiful seed for a yellow flower. And Azeezah and I got a little excited about dandelions. So I just wanted to come back to that as an image.
In fact, we were so excited about it that was also the comment that I wanted to make and ask if Dania would expand on the dandelion comment. And Abby, you talked about how the Azarova affair at UofT really signified a resistance to acknowledging Palestinians as even being human, who have human rights. And so the question of who's considered human, who's considered other than human, who's considered normative and valuable versus what's considered waste and disposable really gets to the heart of what's at issue here, I think. And the metaphor of this dandelion, which is just dismissed as a weed, even though it's a beautiful flower, I think is such a perfect metaphor for this. And I'm really grateful to Dania for conceptualizing it in that way. And if you wanted to say anything else about the dandelion.
Well, my lawn is covered in them, which is really where a lot of this comes from. But, to me, it's like, I did see this, like, in our role is that, we have the dandelion, it's got the puffball of seeds, and, today's event is about blowing on the puffball, the report being the puffball, and then those seeds kind of, dislodging, floating in the air, landing and germinating where they need to be. And I do, people treat dandelions as weeds, but, they, in some ways, Palestinians are kind of like dandelions in the sense that, we have very deep roots in the land, and those roots help break up compacted earth. The leaves are very nutritious. They make delicious salads, and they sort of feed the body with important minerals. And I think my lawn looks beautiful covered in yellow flowers. I think they're very cheerful. And try as my father might to eradicate them, year after year, they come back stronger and stronger. The roots are deeper and deeper, and there's more and more of them. So that's how I think, I see our community, our organizing, the way we use this report. We are seeds, it is, we are strong, our roots are deep, and we should persist, and we will persist. And the report will help in that work, but we also have each other and the networks that we form, and the solidarities that we build with other movements as well. So that, this is sort of where the dandelion conceptualization and metaphor for the report comes from.
Thank you all so much. It's a wonderful place to finish, Dania, and thank you for this incredible report, which is already doing so much work, and you have all touched in different ways on how this report will take us forward to changing the incredible resistance, the conservatism that you all talked about, to speaking about Palestine and to acknowledging Palestinian political, thank you Najib, not only human rights, but political rights. So may you all appreciate the dandelions in your road ahead. And just a final reminder that TPFF, one of Dania's other hats, is showing the tower this Friday at 6:30. Please come and join and support Toronto Palestinian Film Festival, because there's many blossoming dandelions there as well. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all for your strength and your example to us. Good night to all of us.
Thank you, Alejandro and Lena.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro, Lina.